Homily for the 32nd Sunday of the year C, the truth of life after death. In case you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe to this channel and share the homily with others. Our readings for this Sunday are from 2 Maccabees chapter 7 verse 1 to 2 and 9 to 11, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 16 to chapter 3 verse 5, and the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 20 verse 27 to 38. Death is inevitable, but it does not have the final word. For the children of God, death is not the end of everything. Our God is the God of life. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the living and not of the dead. The virtuous shall live and reign in everlasting peace with God, while the wicked will go into everlasting damnation. An example of faith, hope, and courage. Now, 7 Hebrew brothers and their mother were ordered by a pagan king to eat swine's flesh, which is against the law of Moses. They refused to defile themselves and to disobey their God, and they were thus sentenced to a cruel death, which they readily embraced rather than commit sin. As they died one after the other, they each affirmed their faith that death is not the end, that there is life after death, and that there is the resurrection of the just. As their tormentors put pressure on them to renounce their faith and obey the king, they demonstrated that they were willing to undergo any torture and be killed rather than break the law of their ancestors. In this refusal to sin against God, even at the cost of their lives, they left us some key Christian doctrinal principles, such as faith in a God of love and justice, and faith that death is not the end of everything, but rather a passage to new life. They had the hope that the dead shall rise again, that there will be judgment after death, where the just will be vindicated, and that ultimately good shall be victorious over evil, love shall triumph over hate, and life shall conquer death. They stood firm with courage when their faith was tested. They never compromised with evil. They embraced suffering and paid the ultimate price for what they believed. These brothers and their mother aptly demonstrated that whereas physical human life is good and precious, it is not an absolute good. That life in its earthly state is not the highest good, and that obedience to God and the defense of truth must be considered higher goods than physical human life. The brothers and their mother teach us that one must be ready to sacrifice one's life if clinging to it will mean sinning against God or violating truth and justice. They teach us in a most graphic manner that it is better to obey God rather than men. See Acts of Apostles chapter 4 verse 18 to 19 and chapter 5 verse 29. God's covenant relationship with his people is one that calls for unwavering commitment and absolute fidelity. God does not play games with us and will not want us to play games with him. He demands and deserves unwavering commitment and absolute fidelity from us. The early apostles were confronted with similar circumstances as the Maccabean brothers, and they also told their tormentors, it is better to obey God rather than men. The consequence of such a choice in the early church was often martyrdom. According to Norman Cousins, an American author, death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside of us while we live. It matters not, therefore, whether we live or die. What matters most is what we live for and what we are prepared to die for. Now, the resurrection after life. The Sadducees were a very powerful group in Israel with great religious, political, and economic influence, but they did not believe in the immortality of the soul or in the resurrection. They believed that this life is all there is. Life after death was, for them, ridiculous, and the idea of the resurrection was laughable. Jesus' teaching was a threat to their power and influence, so they set out to make a fool of him with their mischievous question. The ridiculous story of the woman who had married and lost 7 husbands in quick succession before her own death was their attempt at this. But Jesus ignored their ensnaring question and instead asked them about the fate of some of the greatest men in their history, such as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. Can you imagine that God created the patriarchs and people like the Blessed Virgin Mary, John the Baptist, Simon Peter, St. Paul, Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Pope John Paul II, etc., only to blot them out of his memory? Do you really think that such righteous and faithful people died and simply perished forever? Do you really think that God, who loved them so much and influenced their lives so intensely, would have forgotten those that even we still remember? For Jesus, to imagine that such beautiful and glorious lives would simply dissolve into nothingness is the height of absurdity. Today's readings raise some of the fundamental questions that have caught the attention of religious people through the ages. They include the following: what is the purpose of human existence? Why do we have to die? What happens after death? Does the suffering of the innocent have any meaning? What will be the reward of the just? What will be the punishment for the unjust? The Sadducees had no answers to these questions, but Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, he will live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. John 11:25-26. And St. Paul adds that if the dead are not raised, then, quote, we are of all people most to be pitied, unquote. 1 Corinthians 15:19. An Indian mystic says that death is not the extinguishing of light, it is simply putting out the lamp because dawn has come. Every Christian should be interested in and become increasingly familiar with life on the other side of Calvary. In the last speech he gave before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. reflected briefly on this other side beyond the horizon as follows: but it really does not matter with me now because I have been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I am not concerned about it now. I just want to do God's will, and He has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the Lord, unquote. This is the typical disposition of the champions of our faith through the course of the centuries. For many of them, physical death is not such a tragedy to dread. It is often seen as a release from the bondage of the flesh. They often looked forward with joyful expectation to their death, which many called their transition, to a new and more glorious life of eternal bliss in the presence of the Lord Jesus in the company of the saints. The hope of conquering death and living eternally with God should strengthen us as we daily face the challenges of witnessing to Christ. This hope of conquering death and living forever with Christ gives strength to the matters of the church and still gives strength to all who live faithful Christian lives today. May the Lord grant us the grace to live today with our gaze in the life that is to come. God bless you.